The subcommittee will come to order, and the purpose of this hearing is to examine the role of Chinese-owned enterprises in fueling conflict, instability, and human rights abuses in Africa, particularly in the mining sector, and I do yield myself for an opening statement. And I, again, want to thank everyone for being here, especially our very distinguished witnesses, and so many others who are very much interested in these very pertinent issues that unfortunately is leading to the great loss of life and all kinds of human rights abuse. So thank you for being here. The extraction of valuable minerals has long been a double-edged sword for many African nations. While these resources hold the potential for economic development, their exploitation, particularly when managed irresponsibly or under corrupt regimes, have often fueled violence and instability. The Democratic Republic of Congo has vast mineral wealth, especially in cobalt and gold and other very, very important minerals, which has been a significant driver of conflict. Illicit gold mining also fuels conflict in Ethiopia and Sudan. Armed groups have profited from the extraction and smuggling of these resources, financing their operations and perpetuating cycles of violence. The United Nations has reported that mineral smuggling finances warfare, with various military forces and commanders exploiting illegal mining for personal gain. In the DRC, it is also estimated that more than 70% of the world's cobalt, some say as much as 75%, an essential mineral for lithium-ion batteries for smartphones, computers, and electric vehicles, is extracted there with bare hands of thousands, and some estimates put it as high as 35,000 children, by one of our witnesses today, Mr. Lezhnev. Thank you for your very heavily footnoted testimony. If that were not horrible enough, the 2024 Trafficking in Persons report also stated that, quote, observers noted that children in mining areas are vulnerable to sexual violence, including sex trafficking, in part due to traditional and religious beliefs that harming children could protect against death or ensure successful mining, close quote. An absurdity, but that's what has been said. China's near monopoly over the output and processing of Africa's minerals resources ensures that these abuses continue unchecked. The expansion of illicit gold mining in Ethiopia has exacerbated existing conflicts as well. Regional states and non-state armed actors vie for control over mining concessions, using the revenues to bolster their influence and, in some cases, to challenge state authority. This competition has intensified local disputes and undermined efforts toward national cohesion. In Sudan, gold mining operations have been linked to funding armed conflicts. The control over lucrative mining areas often leads to violent confrontations between various factions, further destabilizing the region and hindering peace efforts. Illegal mining has led to an environment of degradation and social unrest. The involvement of foreign entities, including Chinese nationals, in these operations has strained local communities and contributed to tensions between populace and the authorities. In response to these challenges, I have reintroduced the Cobalt Supply Chain Act. This legislation aims to ensure that goods made using or containing cobalt refined in the People's Republic of China do not enter the U.S. market, addressing concerns that such cobalt is extracted or processed with the use of child and forced labor in the DRC. Then it comes back in our defense and commercial supply chains. Security is a national security issue, and the reliance on China for these critical minerals is a clear vulnerability to the United States and to the Western world. As co-chair of the Congressional Executive Committee on China, I held a hearing in November of 2023 that highlighted the problem of Chinese Communist Party dominance in the DRC's cobalt supply chain and how China's profits from these unethical mining practices. I also chaired a hearing in July of 2022 of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission on child labor and human rights violations in the mining industry of the DRC. One of our expert witnesses then said that child labor is one of the worst forms of child abuse, and that's absolutely true. It is forbidden by both Congolese legislation as well as international rules and norms, and yet it continues. The greatest beneficiaries of this system, China's state-owned mining companies, remain silent, refusing to confront an undeniable reality. From dirt to battery, from cobalt to cars, the entire supply chain is built on violence, exploitation, and corruption. This must change, and the time for change is now. President Trump's executive order for, quote, immediate measures to increase American mineral production is a crucial step towards strengthening our domestic supply chains. This action will create American jobs, drive economic growth, and reduce our reliance on foreign adversaries. The United States must break its dependence on minerals that finance the Chinese Communist Party, often extracted through forced child labor, and stop indirectly supporting the CCP's efforts to fuel instability and regional conflict in Africa. At the same time, as the CCP tightens its grip on global mineral markets, the U.S. must take decisive action. In line with this strategy, the U.S. Department of State has signaled openness to forming direct critical mineral partnerships with the DRC, an opportunity to strengthen collaboration in securing resources essential for our technological advancement and national security. Today, we have a very distinguished panel of experts that will help us know and give us guidance as a Congress, as a committee, as to where do we go next. And before going to them, it's my delight and my honor to yield to Ms. Jacobs, our ranking member of this subcommittee.
Well, thank you, Chairman Smith, and thank you to all of our witnesses for testifying today on the drivers of conflict and exploitation in Africa's mining sector. As we all know here, there is a long history of exploitation in the mining sector on the African continent that has resulted in environmental degradation, labor exploitation, corruption, and other human rights abuses, and has rarely led to actual prosperity for local communities. There are many drivers of exploitation in the sector, whether that be poor governance that allows corruption to fester, weak judicial institutions that foster a culture of an impunity, lack of economic opportunity for marginalized communities, and so on. These conditions create an environment that's ripe for exploitation by domestic and foreign companies alike. They can act with impunity to cut costs by not adhering to environmental, social, and governance standards due to local corruption eating into their profits. That means poverty wages. That means unsafe and deadly working conditions. That means contaminated water in local communities, and ultimately it means putting short-term gains ahead of the long-term development, stability, and success of the African continent. There is no question that Chinese-owned and operated companies are dominating and engaging in exploitative practices in the mining sector in certain African countries. Many of these companies frankly don't care about the corruption and are not as concerned by the blow to their reputation. For example, just this month, the Kafue River in Zambia was declared dead after a Chinese-owned copper mine contaminated the river. In response, the Zambian government fined this company a measly $10,000. This impunity exists all over the continent. We have also seen other foreign companies operate in the sector and be accused of corruption and human rights abuses. For example, Glencore, a Swiss company, pled guilty in the United States to bribing officials in Nigeria, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Equatorial Guinea, and the DRC, and ultimately agreed to pay the DRC $180 million in a settlement deal. Last year, the Biden administration sanctioned a UAE-based gold company for purchasing gold from the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, ultimately fueling the war and the RSF's genocide. And famously, Israeli businessman Dan Gertler was exposed and subsequently sanctioned for hundreds of millions of dollars worth of opaque and corrupt mining and oil deals in the DRC. We will continue to see these practices until we address what is actually fueling exploitation in the first place. Meanwhile, the United States has long attempted to increase U.S. investment in Africa's mining sector as a means to secure our supply chain and compete with China. But these investments won't come to fruition and won't be advantageous or strategic in the long term if they do not meet high environmental, social, and governance standards to ensure our investments are bringing benefits rather than more exploitation. To do this, the U.S. government and U.S. companies need to consult with local communities on new investments to obtain their consent and assess the impacts project is having on local populations. If we don't do this, U.S. companies will be on the wrong end of protests and public scrutiny experienced by Chinese-owned and operated companies. And that's why I was so disappointed but that the Trump administration recently moved to pause the enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a law that prohibits the bribery of foreign officials to obtain a business advantage and requires transparency for companies. This is the exact kind of law we need to make sure our investments are good. So I urge the Trump administration to reinstate the enforcement of this law immediately. I also continue to be alarmed by the devastating impact of President Trump's foreign aid freeze, including on U.S. efforts to address exploitation in the mining sector. The Trump administration has terminated programs that were improving accountability in DRC's mining sector, working to prevent mining-related violence through dialogue, and enhancing transparency and addressing corruption in the extractive sector. If we are serious about addressing exploitation in the mining sector and bringing mutual benefits to both Africans and Americans, then we need to bring all of our tools to the table. So I look forward to hearing more from our panelists about what is driving exploitation and how we should address it. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. I would like to, before recognizing our distinguished panel, recognize a former member of Congress, and a very distinguished one at that, who has been very active on all of these issues, Mark Walker. Thank you, Mark, for being here and for bringing three Congolese Americans with you who are extremely interested: Adrienne Brons, Elaine Buka, and Wilson Tate. Thank you, Mark, again for meetings we've had recently as well as in the past on all of these relevant issues. You are tremendous. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished panel, beginning first with Mr. Sasha Lezhnev, who is a senior policy advisor at the Sentry, an investigative and policy organization that seeks to disrupt predatory networks that benefit from conflict, repression, and kleptocracy in Africa and beyond. Sasha has spent the past 25 years working on human rights conflict, corruption, and U.S. policy in Africa. He has worked with the Enough Project, and we were just reminiscing about some of the past fights about Darfur and other issues, and he's been here before as a very prized witness, and I thank him, and also he's worked with the U.S. Institute of Peace. We'll then hear from Thierry Dongala, and welcome back. Thierry used to sit here as a member of this subcommittee staff and did a tremendous job at that. He is the founder of Accountable Africa, which conducts supply chain investigations for gold and precious metal traders and provides due diligence reporting for investors in Africa. Previously, he worked, as I said, on this committee as a very distinguished member of the staff, and we do prize his insights. And in meetings prior to this, he had a lot of good information for the committee about this, which helped us frame this hearing. So I want to thank you for that. We'll then hear from Mr. Joseph Mulala Nguramo.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Is a non-resident fellow with the Freedom and Prosperity Center and in the Geostrategy Initiative in the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He was born and spent his formative years in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He was the first and thus far only, I believe, Congolese graduate from the United States Military Academy. What a great accomplishment that is, at West Point, where he majored in defense and strategic studies. And then we'll be hearing from Mr. Obert, who is a Zimbabwean lawyer coming in from Zimbabwe, and I thank you for being on the line here, and legal researcher. He works on international trade and Chinese investments in Africa, natural resource governance, and climate government issues. Previously, Obert coordinated the alignment of Zimbabwe laws with the 2013 Constitution and served as a researcher clerk for the Chief Justice of Namibia, where he provided research support to judges in drafting of court judgments. Thank you. I will now yield to Sasha for such time as he may consume.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Jacobs, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. You all are real champions for human rights, and I greatly appreciate that. I have personally witnessed the horrors of child soldiers and child miners as young as 8 years old in mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as warlords and Chinese and other companies profiting from this exploitation, all in the name of getting us cheaper smartphones and cars. This has got to stop. Africa holds 40% of the world's critical minerals, and China made a strategic decision a decade ago to procure them, spending well over $10 billion acquiring mines. but the investments have come with corruption and human rights abuses. Nowhere has these problems been more acute than the Democratic Republic of Congo, the world's largest producer of cobalt and tantalum and the second largest producer of copper. Corruption has only increased since the China DRC mega deal worth $6.2 billion in 2008. The DRC's corruption rating is lower today under President Tshisekedi than under his predecessor, Joseph Kabila. My organization, The Sentry, investigated these deals and found $238 million and then $55 million that went missing. And major Chinese and other mining contracts remain opaque today. Unfortunately, corruption has not been limited to the Chinese. International tycoon Dan Gertler was sanctioned during the first Trump administration after his corrupt mining and oil deals led the DRC to lose $1.3 billion. Human rights is also worsening, with increasing repression and thousands of child miners working at mines that send cobalt mainly to Chinese crude refiners. The president's security force has illegally controlled mines, and thousands of people have been forcibly evicted to make way for Chinese mines in particular. Another mineral, gold, which you highlighted, has also been at the heart of this escalating conflict in eastern Congo, which has displaced 6.5 million people. It's the world's third largest displacement crisis. Gold is a chief source of revenue for armed groups. Backed by Rwanda, M23 has taken over gold mines, and Rwanda's new refinery was sanctioned by the European Union last week after exporting $800 million worth of gold and illegally profiting from conflict gold. This gold is then smuggled to the UAE, China, and other countries. And China has been active in the conflict gold trade, from a $38 million operation where a Chinese company paid armed groups for access to 400 illegal mining operations in South Kivu today that have allegedly smuggled up to 8 tons of gold annually following bribes. And China is purchasing record amounts of gold today, potentially to establish a new BRICS currency that would chip away at the US dollar. This is not a hopeless situation. Leverage exists in these supply chains, and the US government, electronics companies, and banks in particular can make an impact in 3 areas. The biggest obstacle to eliminating mining abuses is the system of kleptocracy in the DRC. This system of state capture allows ruling elites and their commercial partners to personally profit while leaving the population to suffer from poor security, education, and health care. They use violence to maintain power and repress dissent. This system will continue unless there are consequences for that corruption. Addressing this would also level the playing field for U.S. companies. The Treasury Department, under Secretary Bessent, should robustly investigate and sanction the networks that facilitate grand corruption, from refineries in Uganda, Rwanda, and the UAE that trade in conflict gold, Chinese middlemen, and senior DRC officials who facilitate bribes and aid illegal armed groups like the FDLR. There must also be judicial accountability for abuses, and the administration and Congress should support the establishment of a DRC transitional justice mechanism as advocated by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Dr. Denis Mukwege. Second, the U.S. government has a key role to play in combating the conflict gold trade in particular. Secretary of State Marco Rubio should lead a public-private initiative to combat illicit gold, partnering with the London Bullion Market Association and bullion banks. The initiative should both increase gold trade data transparency to ensure that sanctions bodies aren't behind the curve of criminal actors and empower independent monitoring teams to inspect and certify gold smuggling hubs such as cash for gold markets. Secretary Rubio and Secretary Bessent should also establish an illicit gold task force to robustly investigate and sanction trafficking networks. As part of it, Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, could issue alerts and keep banks updated. Third, China still needs U.S. markets. So Tesla, Apple, and others have important leverage over Chinese suppliers. Sunlight is the best disinfectant to clean up corruption, especially through mining contract transparency. High-tech and auto companies should use their buying power to require Chinese and all suppliers to publish the ownership structures of mining companies, contracts, and service providers, hire their Congolese workforce directly, not through subs, and source only from crude refiners of cobalt and copper that have passed the electronics industry audits by Responsible Minerals Initiative. Relatedly, the State Department and companies should strongly urge the DRC Mining Ministry to create more artisanal mining zones to give miners the legal space to operate and reduce abuses. Finally, it's important that the administration should nominate an Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs with urgency to coordinate responses to the DRC in all of these crises. In sum, the U.S. government, in coordination with electronics companies and banks, can combat the abuses and corruption by China and others in the mining sector and reduce risks for U.S. businesses. I sincerely hope that progress is made so Congolese and other mining communities in Africa no longer experience the horrors that I've personally witnessed. Thank you very much.
Very much. Thierry?
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Jacobs, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify on metals, mining, minerals, and how the CCP fuels conflict and exploitation in Africa. Your leadership and interest in this topic is timely and warranted, as the majority of the conflict zones in Africa are around mineral deposits. So as a due diligence firm that has conducted supply chain investigations in various countries, ranging from Tanzania to Sudan, Ethiopia, DRC, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and so forth, Accountable Africa has been on the front lines of steering investors and traders away from the pitfalls of illicit mining practices and networks, which are ever growing. Without saying any names, I just want to thank those responsible investors and traders that we have worked with over the past 5 years who have shown the courage to do business responsibly. All too often, our due diligence reports have given them the tough counsel of having to turn down lucrative African mineral deals for the sake of maintaining their clean conscience and protecting their reputation, which for them it costs. We're sure it wasn't easy to explain to their shareholders, that they had to forego these steep discounts and wildcat profits. But I just want to let them know that they maintained not only a clean reputation and conscience, but they respected the dignity of the African communities in which they operate. So I'd like to start this testimony also with a personal story. When I got married in the Congo, a pastor, Dede, held our wedding bands, and he kind of weighed them, and was like, "This is real gold, I think." And after he said, "This is real gold," he held the wedding bands up and kind of had a prayer, a sanctification prayer, saying, whatever the trail of the trail of supply for these gold rings may be sanctified to start, a heavenly union. And this kind of surprised me because, I'm in the business of conducting supply chain investigations, and here I am in church, and the pastor's bringing it up, and it kind of brought to mind how familiar, all too familiar, the Congolese are with the trail of sin and suffering that can follow behind these minerals, gold, cobalt. So we're talking about an issue that is not far from the common man on the street, whether it's in the Congo or in our iPhones here in Washington. The part that matters the most, I would say, is what is clean gold. We have so many standards floating out there that it gives wiggle room for people to abuse the systems of certification. I think this is at the source of what a lot of the conflict and a lot of the exploitation comes from, because a lot of them are wiggling out of accountability because they're getting certified, and some people are considering it clean and others aren't. So going on to that point of a moral standard needing to be established in the industry, today we can witness that there are too many unaccountable and foreign entities that get to determine what makes minerals clean in Africa. My colleague Sasha mentioned LBMA, which is one of the good bodies trying to do a lot of proactive work. But at some point, these bodies need to come together. UAE has their standard. LBMA has their standard. So stemming the corruption and the conflict fomented by the bad actors that take advantage of this wiggle room will require us standardizing that definition of what is clean. I don't want to be too verbose, but I kind of want to show another anecdote. today some Western, audit firm can certify something clean, and they had never been on the ground. Or if they go on the ground, it's a show of, 2 or 3 hours, and they go take pictures and go. But I want to say how local fishers in the Congo can have a different perspective than these audit firms. A local fisher can look by looking at the, a local school. Let me start by the local school. A local school can look by the local school principal can look by the attendance of the schools. Right? A lot of times when you introduce cash into the gold mines, you'll start to see attendance levels, especially at the primary school, dip. And so the principal could probably tell you if the gold mine is clean or not, because a lot of his students are going to the gold mine because there's cash. The local fishers also can tell you just by the impact of the fish that they're catching, the environmental impact. So this sort of moral standard needs to take into account local mechanisms for judging the cleanliness of the minerals. When governments and communities get serious about enforcing a standard of cleanliness for mining activity, bad actors can't operate. As Sasha mentioned, you turn on the light is the biggest disinfectant. I like to say when you turn on the lights, the roaches scatter, This African moral sovereignty that we need to include into accountability standards requires the retreat of not necessarily foreign authorities, but at the same time, we need African moral leadership to rise to the occasion. We've seen it with the case of ITSCI, where they tried to establish a standard of certification. This was based in Kigali, but based on reports from Global Witness, this was a compromised certification process. Global Witness issued a report in 2022 that the ITSCI was effectively a laundromat, how a due diligence scheme appears to launder conflict minerals. So this is an example where we have just various authority structures claiming something clean, and then it gives wiggle room, and next thing you know, they're funding conflict. So I want to recommend 2 more things apart from standardization of the moral of what is clean gold. I want to recommend competition. This is something that doesn't cost the U.S. government any money. Right now, we're at a stage of all pretty much sanction is our main tool, which it's effective on the ground. But I believe that we can do not necessarily all stick and no carrot. I think we could add a carrot to that stick. Under existing authorities, OFAC has authority to license activities. So if we could encourage traders to apply for licenses, this would effectively bring competition to the space. Because right now, in countries like DRC, Sudan, and all the others that have network sanctions in place, what happens is, as soon as the sanction system is in place, investors and bankers who usually finance the mining activity run away because they don't have time to decipher between the good and the bad actors. And so what happens is that even the good actors, the ones that are willing to be accountable, they'll run away, and not necessarily run away, they'll run to the only competition that's still there, and that's usually the Chinese and other bad actors. So if we could establish kind of a licensing channel, which the authorities exist, where traders can proactively submit their trading data to OFAC to maintain their licenses, not only would OFAC be able to stay ahead of the curve of illicit gold trends because they would be gathering data, but also we would be rewarding those who are doing good in the space, whether it's gold, cobalt, and others. In the absence of competition, we've given the market over to bad actors, including China. The last recommendation, I think, is quite just a development recommendation. It's supporting industrial energy projects like the Grand Inga Dam in the DRC. How does that matter? Well, doing this will make the economics of exporting processed minerals to China comparatively costly. Right now, the race for strategic minerals is not for the deposits, but for the refining capacity. China controls over 85% of the world's refining capacity for rare earths. It's because energy is cheap in China. Prioritizing the DRC's launch of the Grand Inga Dam project will undercut China's export-led growth model that dumps products and labor in Africa while also interrupting China's mineral extraction barter system that circumvents the US dollar in Africa. This is really key because if energy is cheap in DRC and the minerals can be processed in DRC and transformed, there's no need to send it to China. And lastly, I want to end on a warm note. I just came back from Sudan where I conducted another supply chain investigation. It was during the month of Ramadan. And the mining community I visited in the north didn't have much, external wealth. But you couldn't guess it from the amount of food and charity they shared at the breaking of their fast with me. Though everyone was living through a civil war, because Sudan's, right, is a civil war, and they all joined in their hard-knock pursuit of gold at the mining site, these communities maintained the utmost hospitality. It reminded me that the mining activity doesn't happen in a void, but within a social fabric that must be respected. By visitors, investors, governments alike, this social fabric can be respected, but we notice that this is the challenge of the African model in Africa. They don't respect the social fabric in mining communities, which we can. Thank you.
I'd like to now recognize Mr. Nguramo.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Jacob, and the other member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa for the invitation to testify on metal, minerals, and mining, and how the CCP fuels conflicts and exploitation in Africa. My name is Joseph Mulala Nguramo. I am a Congolese national, and I grew up in the Western region of Kivu in eastern Congo, particularly Goma. I was honored to graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 2014, and I'm currently an Nonresident Fellow with the Freedom and Prosperity and the Scowcroft Centers at the Atlantic Council. I am grateful to the U.S. and the American people for the great opportunity to dedicate my professional career to the building of U.S.-African relations, as well as promoting democracy, freedom, and good governance. I'm humbled and honored to be invited here to share my thoughts on these issues. My testimony will look at the impact of Chinese mining in the DRC and the implication to U.S. national security in the region. The DRC's wealth in natural resources is estimated at $24 trillion, representing 70% of global cobalt and a proven reserve of gold, coltan, lithium, copper, and diamonds. As long as the Chinese Communist Party controls the mining sector in the DRC, the entire region remains economically fragile and is threatened by civil unrest. The CCP has been playing a predatory game flicks and corruption, encouraging bad governance, emboldening the rise of autocratic tyrannical regimes, leading to a significant regression of democracy around the world, as the Atlantic Council Freedom and Prosperity Project report have demonstrated. Currently, the volume of trade between Africa and China is estimated at $280.1 billion, and is rising steadily by 1.5% annually as of last year. Yet, almost investment are in the mining and infrastructure sectors without long-term benefit to the country's GDP and the populations. Indeed, the CCP routinely operates in shadow of governments that lack transparency and they care little for human rights and democracy. I wish to argue that political and social stability in the DRC is essential to the U.S. national security. In the DRC, ongoing civil unrest and unmitigated humanitarian crisis are largely due to China's ruthless and irresponsible grip on the country's natural resources. Controlling almost 90% of Congo's mining sector, the CCP has failed to use its economics and financial power to defend and promote the rule of law, freedom, and equality of governance, but has instead masked a strategy to take advantage of a country in chaos. China has significant and economic interest in the DRC, and to just name an additional example, in Sudan. And yet, the countries are at the precipice of collapsing, becoming failed states, no different with the tragic situation going on right now in Haiti. While the U.S. government has come to characterize the ongoing massacre in Sudan as a genocide, I'll focus more on the DRC because the nature and the character of the ongoing conflict between Rwanda and the DRC are of a magnitude to destabilize the entire region and significantly impact U.S. national security. The DRC minerals have become essential in the world transition to clean energy and are a key component in microchips and semiconductors, which we use in our critical infrastructures, advanced weapon systems, technology including missile defense, fighter jets, satellites, communication equipment, and relate to recent developments. Unfortunately, the current DRC government lacks the competence and leadership to ensure a safe and a consistent supply of this product. It has instead allowed China to control the mining sector. Given this situation, the U.S. and the allies' national security will be experiencing growing dependence on the CCP's global supply chain. This process will be precipitated as the DRC and Rwanda are on the brink of a war, and the stability of the entire region is frightened. The latest developments in Sudan and African Lake region are cause for alarm. The CCP mercantilist model is aimed at securing monopolies over critical natural resources. To that end, it's aimed to create illegitimate and unstable political systems in places like the DRC and Sudan, planting seed of civil unrest, violence, and wars. Despite the dominance in the mining and the DRC mining sector, the CCP has failed to advocate for implementing good governance, defending human rights, fighting corruption, and protecting fair and good elections to ensure sustainable stability and prosperity. For example, China demonstrated no interest at all in the transparency and legitimacy of the DRC presidential elections in the past elections. Not surprisingly, China has remained silent about the DRC government's widely understood abuse of power. A similar trend of violence and the humanitarian catastrophe can be observed in Sudan. Despite investing billions of dollars in oil, China has stood by as Sudan has become a failed state. China even opposed UN Security Council resolution to hold the Sudanese government and the rebel accountable for the genocide, all in the interest of its own gain. In exchange, the Sudanese government backed China's stance on issues like the Hong Kong national security laws and the Xinjiang conflict. According to Transparency International's 24 report, Corruption Perception Index, about 90% of African countries score below 50, indicating high level of corruption and mediocre governance. Just the Sub-Saharan Africa alone scored an average of 33% out of 100, making it the lowest scoring region globally. U.S. government report on global business climate, religion freedom, human trafficking, and the right support and document these allegations. China remained indifferent as long as China empower a democratic regime for its own gain, the future of democracy remained fragile. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, the CCP controls about 40% of global energy reserve. It does so by disregarding human costs and the nature of government it's worked with. Just in the DRC alone, China has come to control almost 90% of the consuming sector, led by the Chinese company such as, to pronounce China Molybdenum, Hiace Cobalt, and Norinco. The CCP defense contractor Norinco, as it turned out, also acquired stakes in the DRC, has been looking to acquire stakes in the DRC defense security sector, and has been supplying weapons and the military drone to various participants in the ongoing DRC conflict. China, by failing to control the distribution of military weapons, continued to fuel the conflict. Alternatively stated, combined with a veto power of the UN Security Council, China has failed to use its economic and financial power in Africa to defend and promote the rule of law, freedom, and equality of government, and to help prevent conflicts. Ultimately, political and social chaos in Africa benefit China's economic interests by keeping Western investment collaboration at bay. To conclude, the Chinese model is based on exploiting Africa's natural resources to the detriment of U.S. national security interests. Concurrently, it's prop up corrupt political systems led in place by predatory, kleptocratic elites who enrich themselves at the expense of their own citizens. These systems perpetuate poverty and lead to regional conflicts and wars, and it can be witnessed in Sudan and the DRC. The U.S. national security approach countering China in Africa should be a bipartisan concern, transcending administrations and short-term thinking. The U.S. needs a comprehensive and a coherent long-term grand strategy, not just focusing on Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Africa is the future of the world because of the growing and dynamic young populations and abundance of natural resources. I hope that the U.S. government and its allies will do their utmost to avert a regional war in the DRC and to bring stability to the region. There have been years of passivity and inaction regarding Africa, and the U.S. has been too slow to recognize how its own national security interests are tied to peace and stability and economic development of the African continent, especially Central Africa. It is crucial that the U.S. counter China's grip on natural resources within the region in the interest of the own national security, democracy, and human rights in Africa. The United States should take its responsibility as a moral global leader of international rule-based international world order. If the U.S. fails to lead, who else will? Certainly, in the absence of U.S. global leadership and engagement, the vacuum will be filled by autocratic, repressive, tyrannical, and authoritarian regime, as we are seeing in Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, Sudan, and certainly the DRC. Unfortunately, back in the line with the CCP. I appreciate your attention and of this issue, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for your testimony and your insights. I'd like to now recognize from Zimbabwe, Mr. Boer.
Chairman Smith, kindly confirm if you can hear me.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Sarah Jacobs, and distinguished committee members, I appreciate this opportunity to testify before this committee on metals, minerals, and mining, and how CCP influences conflict and exploitation in Africa. I am indeed honored to appear before you today. I serve as a program lead on responsible business and investments of the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, a public interest law organization with over 20 years of using the law to promote equitable, beg your pardon?
You can keep going.
Please continue.
Thank you. Well, as I was saying, there's a bit of some feedback.
Our end, but on yours, can you? Oh, good, good.
Right, I'll go ahead. I serve as the responsible investment and business program lead for an organization called Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, which is essentially a public interest law organization with over 20 years of experience in using the law to promote equitable, just, and sustainable natural resource management and economic benefits and protection of rights of marginalized communities in Zimbabwe and the Southern Africa region. Before I share my insights and perspective on what drives conflict and exploitation in the mining sector in Africa, allow me to provide a bit of some context and why Africa is a key player in the global mineral supply chains. I think speakers before me have already alluded to the fact that Africa is endowed with abundant mineral resources. The continent actually is home to an estimate of 30% of world's mineral resources, with 8% of natural gas, 12% of world's oil reserve, and 50% of the world's gold, as well as 90% of the global chrome. With these abundant metals and minerals, this sector is actually a backbone of several African economies and continues to generate significant foreign currency and revenue, as well as creating opportunities for employment. 42 out of 54 African countries are classified as resource dependent. This is enormous. This tells us that the entire African continent depends on those minerals for revenue generation And according to the African Union's Africa Mining Vision, it recognizes the potential of mining in driving broad-based economic development on the continent. And in terms of critical minerals required to transition to renewable energy and meet the climate goals, Africa also occupies a strategic position. The continent holds about 70% of the world's cobalt, 60% of the world's manganese, 25% of the world's bauxite, and nearly 15% of the world's copper, amongst many other critical minerals. And Zimbabwe, where I am from, where I was born, has the largest lithium reserves in Africa and 6th in the world, as well as the second largest chrome deposits in the world. Without a doubt, committee members, mining continues and should drive economic development for the continent. However, while mining presents these huge, enormous economic opportunities for development, it has not been easy for the continent to harness and maximize benefits from its natural resources. The sector has been plagued by governance challenges due to structural problems. There's been years of corruption that has remained a significant barrier to responsible investments and sustainable mining. Several companies, both Chinese and non-Chinese, have been implicated in corrupt practices to secure mining concessions. You all know of cases like Glencore, where they have accepted to pay fines as a result of using bribes to secure mining and oil contracts in multiple African countries. You also have companies like Barlow Group, a French company that was fined 12 million for corrupt charges in Togo. Similarly, Chinese entities like China Non-Ferrous Metals Mining and Corporation, as well as China Offshore Oil Corporation, have been implicated in corrupt deals in both Zambia and DRC, and even Nigeria. While these are just examples of large corporations implicated, they are not the only bad guys. They are simply the ones that were caught on the wrong side. For years, places like Kivu in the Congo have been afflicted by conflicts intricately related to its vast mineral resources. Various actors, including multinational corporations, have also been implicated in activities that exacerbate these conflicts. Some of the major tech companies from the US, Apple, have also faced some scrutiny over the potential use of conflict minerals such as tin, tantalite, tungsten, and cobalt from DRC. Linked to the governance challenges, fueling tensions and clashes among communities and mining corporations, African countries have outdated mining legislation which create loopholes that foreign entities can exploit. For instance, Zimbabwe uses a 1961 piece of legislation that was created at a time when the country was under colonial rule. As an organization, Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association and many other players, we have been advocating for reform of the Mines and Minerals Act to include provisions for higher standards for transparency and accountability and transparency in how mining rights and title is awarded. So essentially, many African countries, they have weak regulatory frameworks that do not reflect the changing global context, that require higher standards of environmental, social, and governance requirements. A case in point is where a Chinese company by the name Bekita Minerals, which operates the largest lithium project in the world, the oldest, largest project in the world, and the largest in Zimbabwe, polluted a major community dam and was merely fined $5,000, a figure that does not reflect the environmental harm and even the impact that the community would face. There was a similar case in Zambia, which I'm glad member Sir Jacobs mentioned earlier on, in Zambia, where the company was simply fined $10,000 for environmental pollution, despite the enormous environmental and public damage that resulted from that pollution. So beyond regulatory gaps and weak institutions, Challenges in the sector are also coupled with high levels of unemployment on the continent, which create opportunities for predatory employment practices where companies tend to employ vulnerable labor force, which is often exploited easily as they are desperate for jobs. In the DRC, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, and many other countries, both Chinese and Western companies have been accused of underpaying workers in failing to provide adequate safety equipment, providing a workplace, safe and health equipment. We know of several workers whose employment contracts have been terminated for seeking to enforce their constitutionally guaranteed labor rights. Another important factor aiding the exploitation of Africa's minerals is the continent's desperation for investment to finance development. This has resulted in several resource-backed loan agreements being signed, where African governments have been exchanging mining rights or mineral resources for infrastructure development. In theory, if the borrowing process is carried out transparently and effectively, and if the loans have favorable terms and the infrastructure projects are well selected and executed, the transactions would be expected to generate positive returns for the borrowing countries. However, this is not the case. As of 2018, more than 11 African countries had signed resource-backed deals with Chinese financial institutions, whose terms are often opaque and result in unsustainable debt levels and exploitation of natural resources. A case in point is Angola deal with Export-Import Bank of China, which raised serious concerns about debt sustainability. For China, it is evident that it is strategically using its financial muscle through resource-backed loans to exploit natural resources and court African governments into sweet deals which are difficult to turn down. As a result of as most African governments require finance for development. In some instances, the opaqueness of these deals have resulted in some governments actually questioning how their predecessors would have entered into those contracts. And as the scramble for critical minerals intensifies and geopolitical tensions, it is evident that resource-rich countries are more prone to conflict and social instability that are linked to their mineral resources. One of our recent studies in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and DRC has reviewed several instances of forced displacement linked to extraction of critical minerals and even social unrest and violation of human rights. For instance, in Zimbabwe, Chinese lithium mining projects in areas such as Buhera, Kamativi, Bikita, Gwanda have contributed to social tensions due to lack of real and tangible community benefits as well as unfair labor practices. As if that is not enough, there is now increased competition over water between communities and companies, given that the process of processing hard rock lithium is water intensive. And I must mention, hard rock lithium found in Zimbabwe is concentrated in water-strained regions, which makes it very, very difficult for companies to extract water, but also increases competition for communities to use water that they need for everyday life. A study by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center on the impact of China's global investments in investments on human rights between 2013 and 2020, it shows that Africa had the second highest number of human rights abuses that are recorded against Chinese companies. And in the face of all these violations, communities impacted, they struggle to access remedies and seek redress because of captured judiciaries. Furthermore, several Chinese projects are linked to cases of forced displacement. For instance, a BYD-sponsored project by Shenzhen Lithium Project in the eastern part of Zimbabwe has been hailed as a good example for responsible mining project. Yet several communities from this area were not adequately compensated and they were displaced. In places like Cabo Delgado as well in Mozambique, there have been serious tensions as a result of projects that Total Energy has been exploiting. So evidently, this is not only the Chinese that are contributing and fueling conflict and exploitation of Africa's mineral resources. There are several other companies that are not Chinese that are also, implicit. In coming to my conclusion, I want to make 4 recommendations on what the U.S. government can do. One of the key things we think is important is to rethink the engagement strategy with Africa, particularly to secure critical minerals for shared prosperity. African governments are now banning export of unprocessed minerals in line with the recently launched Africa Green Mineral Strategy, which was just launched in Ethiopia and Addis Ababa last week. And the idea is to compel beneficiation and value addition of projects on the continent. This provides an opportunity for the U.S. to strategically provide the requisite skills and knowledge by setting up refinery plans in partnership with African actors. Secondly, while the U.S. government is currently engaging with DRC for a deal for critical minerals for security, it should expand its engagement. We know of the Lobito corridor, deal with Angola, DRC, and Zambia. Of course, Zimbabwe has been excluded out of this. But one of the key things we know is that there is need for technical assistance around responsible mining, traceability, and responsible standards. Zimbabwe and many African countries are looking at potential partners to break the cycle of Chinese dominance. And it is important for me to highlight that due to sanctions for countries like Zimbabwe, they felt abandoned and China took advantage. And in some contexts, because of the desperation to look for the lowest suitor available, China became one of the investors that was there for the country to, award mining deals. So I think we need to ensure that as the U.S. government rethink its sanction regime on countries like Zimbabwe, because when sanctions were imposed by the U.S. government, it created a void, and companies that had disinvested created an opportunity for Chinese companies. So I call upon the U.S. government to also look at its sanction regime on Zimbabwe. Thirdly, I think my speaker colleagues before me have already talked about providing alternative markets and diversify the investment portfolio for the continent. But my last recommendation is supporting democracy and governance actors, particularly NGOs that are working to improve the regulatory frameworks and enforcement capacity around state institutions, because the role of civil society in exposing corruption, human rights abuses, cannot be understated. It is crucial for the U.S. government, I think, to rethink again foreign funding towards these institutions. And for U.S. companies, just 3 key recommendations. U.S. companies that are contemplating on investing in Africa, they should set higher standards for environmental, labor, and governance. This is crucial for them to manage reputational risks and also avoid clashes with the local populations. It is vital for us to ensure that we have something to compare with. Currently, in countries like Zimbabwe, for instance, there is nothing to compare with. So if you say Chinese are bad, but there is no a lot of Western investment that can be compared with to set the best practice or the benchmark. U.S. companies should also ensure that if they are investing in Africa, communities are benefiting from these natural resources by putting in place community benefit sharing mechanisms and corporate social responsibility. This has been done somewhere and it has worked. And lastly, I think I want to emphasize due diligence as a key recommendation, that there is proper due diligence where communities where the minerals are being extracted are actually consulted in the process of audit. I think the colleagues before me have mentioned how some of the frameworks that are there are not inclusive. You claim that a company has undertaken due diligence in a way setting up there in Europe or in the US. Communities where the mineral is coming from have actually not been consulted. In conclusion, the U.S. has an opportunity to initiate and enter into critical mineral deals in a transparent manner with higher ESG standards and provide alternatives to counter Chinese dominance. With better options and alternatives, African governments may begin to see how certain deals that they've entered into with Chinese are predatory and not beneficial to them. This can also serve as an example of how responsible investments can be done. And thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so very much for your testimony. And I have a number of questions, but I'll just ask two because we do have such a great turnout for this hearing, underscoring the importance so many members on both sides of the aisle attribute to it. So I'll come back and ask other questions in the second round, and anyone else who would like to do it then as well. You know, in 2008, I traveled to Goma when very credible reports surfaced that UN peacekeepers were raping young children as young as 12 and 13, bribing them, and for a meal, were exploiting them sexually. I went over there. I chaired 4 congressional hearings on the issue, and Kofi Annan issued his zero tolerance policy, which sounded good. Jane Hall Lute from the UN came and testified, very well-meaning, and it was very sincere. But at the end of the day, after lack of enforcement of the zero tolerance policy, I held an additional hearing about zero compliance with the zero tolerance policy. Because again, words are great, policies are great, but if they're not enforced, they are close to being meaningless, if not worse, because they give a false sense of hope. This year's Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the report, the TIP report for 2024 on DR Congo, points out, and I quote them, in 2020, the DRC's Minister of Human Rights issued a decree increasing oversight of mining communities, including a zero tolerance policy for forced child labor in the mining sector. However, the government did not report certifying any mines or identifying any potential victims during the reporting period. And very disturbing, again, well-meaning, but what happened with regards to implementation. If our witnesses could speak to that, because, you know, these artisanal mines are catastrophic to children. Obviously, all the mines, when you have forced labor, and one of our previous hearings on this very issue pointed out that these children are not getting, you know, they shouldn't be there in the first place. It's child labor. It's a violation of fundamental human rights, their rights, but they also don't have the right kind of gear. So they're breathing in dust as they're, in the case of cobalt mining, and they get very sick. Some die, but many get very, very sick, and the long-term consequences are absolutely deleterious to their lives. So if you could speak to that, and parenthetically, along the same lines, you know, the GAO, General Accountability Office, or Government Accountability Office, issued a report on Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Act, and it pointed out that in 2023, 62% of the companies did perform due diligence to determine the responsible source of conflict minerals, and they were unable to determine the mineral source. So again, things get blocked, well-meaning, but it doesn't. And finally, I'll just point out, you know, I've been very, very concerned because I've chaired 106 congressional hearings on human rights in China. I do chair the China Commission, and I'm shocked at how they exploit their own labor, how they, you know, whether it be in Xinjiang or anywhere else, you know, the use of forced labor is prevalent throughout all of China, and that same mindset and that same sense of exploitation is carried right into Africa as they procure things like cobalt and, again, child and adult forced labor. And what's it all about when it comes to cobalt? You know, the China's share of the global electric vehicles in this past year, 2024, skyrocketed to 76%. A fourth of all the EVs in Europe are coming from China. So this is all about making more money on the backs of children, African children, and on the backs of their parents. So if you could speak to those issues, you know, including this lack of real due diligence, the lack of enforcement of a zero tolerance policy that sounded great when it was issued.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith. I think it's you just characterize it correctly. We need to be, I think, we need to be very demanding in terms of accountability. zero tolerance policy. From my modest experience living here in the US, I know we mean well. We try to help. But we really have to be very direct, particularly in places like the DRC, because in this country, they are actually the officials who are supposed to enforce the laws and the policy in their country. So if they don't do that, we can do that. So I like to think that, yeah, we have to put a lot of pressure on the officials in these countries to make sure they're actually enforcing their own policy and their own laws, and to punish actually people who are doing bad stuff. Thanks.
I just wanted to encourage. I thank you for the tips question, because I'm gonna share an industry kind of trick that I've been using that has helped us. So we've been monitoring, like I said, the school attendance levels. That data is very valuable, because we know that if we start to see the school attendance levels to drop, we need to start looking for where these kids are going. So I think the future tips report should find a way to include these data points of attendance levels in mining areas, something worth monitoring, because from an industry practice of due diligence, I use it to say, okay, look, we need to start looking at this. And then from due diligence side, you know, the big issue is that due diligence is seen as a Western demand, or, you know, and there's no local buy-in in due diligence. But if we can translate this due diligence demand locally, like the example I used of Pastor Dede, you know, about the gold, that notion exists locally. But if you can get buy-in from, you know, like I say, whether it's the local school principal, the local fishers union, the mothers of the children, they do have buy-in on the environment. So that being said, I think if we could get more of the local mining communities involved in due diligence processes and even getting their signatures on the certification, it will render more effective and even enforcement, because then the community will be like, you don't have our certification, why are you here, you know? So yeah.
I would just add that it's the systematic kleptocracy that is the heart of exactly what you're talking about, Chairman Smith. I met a mining inspector in the DRC who told me, frankly, I live on the back of the local population, and I'm incentivized to get money from them and then pass the money up the chain. Otherwise, they'll replace me here. And to change that system, you need transparency, accountability, and incentives for a clean trade. I think the legislation that you highlighted needs to be kept, because it's a baseline. Without that, you have the free-for-all that we had before when you visited in 2008, and Congolese, a whole group of Congolese civil society organizations, over 100 of them, wrote during the first Trump administration saying if you repeal this Conflict Minerals Act, that it would be reactivated, the terrorist networks and the armed groups, which would be very bad. But it needs to be supplemented by other measures to incentivize responsible investment, like Thierry mentioned, which is very important. There is such a thing as the Burma Responsible Investment Reporting Requirements, and we can follow on that. We can have awards for responsible investment from the State Department and others. And then we need a better system to trace these minerals that is much more accountable and transparent. Thierry highlighted this ITSKI system that has failed, and the Responsible Minerals Initiative suspended them, and you know, unless they're seriously reformed or replaced, you know, that really needs to be much more transparent on the ground, and we need a better system for gold, which we talked about. Only those kind of things, plus incentivizing legal artisanal mining, then, you know, if it's legal, if people are following the law, children will not be there, at least of a certain age. So I think those kind of things can help. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Boer?
Okay, thank you so much for the question. I think for me, you know, there's a cocktail of tools that can be utilized to address the problem. My colleagues told me, they mentioned the importance of due diligence. And when you look at due diligence, in most cases, I think 2 months ago, I visited a lithium project. It's a project owned by a Chinese company by the name Sichuan Yawa. Basically, this company has they have a joint venture with the Zimbabwean government, and they're mining lithium. And you get into the community and ask them, have they ever been consulted about this project that that has been, exploited by this company? Most of them, they have never been consulted, but there is an environmental impact assessment report that was, approved by EMA, which is the regulator. And you start asking, so how you do have a legislation that requires environmental management agencies to, sort of like approve only if there's consultation that are inclusive and communities have not been consulted. So you see that institutions, they might not actually be implementing the law that exists. You have institutions that are not necessarily doing their duty and the law exists. Then you further probe, you're asking these guys, so where are you sending your lithium to? Who are you buying? They start telling you, we are buying, we are selling to companies like BMW, to LG, to Tesla. And some of them were even saying Tesla was, in Zimbabwe doing due diligence. I live the company, I go to the community. Have you ever heard of a company by the name Tesla here? So one of the key things that I need to insist, when tech companies are doing due diligence, they shouldn't just rely on the data that they get from the mining companies themselves. They have to go to the traditional leaders in the area. The local leaders will give them more information about how their, community members are being impacted by the project. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you. As we've discussed already, there is a long history of exploitation in the mining sector on the African continent. Exploitation has emanated from not just Chinese companies, but from other foreign companies too. So if we're serious about preventing and addressing exploitation in this sector, we need to address the core drivers rather than just focus on one specific actor. So, Mr. Bore, I was hoping you could explain why exploitation and corruption is so rampant in the mining industry, and why are so many companies able to take advantage and often get away with corruption, exploitation, and diversion of minerals?
Thank you so much for that question. And for me, I think exploitation and corruption in the mining sector is a systematic issue that is driven by a combination of factors, both governance challenges, lack of regulatory enforcement, power imbalances between the state, the host government, and also the multinational companies. In most instances, multinational companies are able to negotiate deals because of the power imbalances. And in many African countries, mining, operations are taking place in a politically unstable and, economically very fragile environment where institutions are very weak and oversight mechanisms are, sometimes compromised. So there are a number of factors and why companies, exploiting. So I mentioned earlier on during my address the issue of resource-backed loans. I think it's one of the key things that we have noticed because almost all the loan agreements that are extended to African governments by Chinese financial institutions, they are not known in the public. No one can scrutinize them. And minerals are, collateralized, for future mineral with future mineral production, but no one really knows. And even the estimate of the value of the minerals that are being collateralized, for purposes of infrastructure development. So that's one of the key factors. I think if African countries could have access to credit and not use, resource-backed loans as a strategy to get access to finance for development, we could, I think, break the cycle. The other thing is regulatory capture. I think this point has been overemphasized. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lezhnev, anything to add?
Thanks for the great question. I would say two reasons, lack of transparency and lack of real accountability. You highlighted the excellent case that the U.S. government sanctioned a UAE-based gold refiner for sourcing from the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan. That's just the tip of the iceberg. That was one company. There's a whole supply chain there of RSF companies and UAE-based companies that are, trading tens of tons of gold per year and fueling that that conflict, we need to go much deeper and much more robustly into those networks to hold them accountable. I think number two is there needs to be transparency to level the playing field for all companies. So the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative is a great example of that. Chinese, Russian, whatever company is extracting minerals in that country has to play by those rules. Now, there needs to be better enforcement of the EITI standards. So, for example, they now require contract transparency. Only 26% of the countries implementing this contract transparency are actually fully disclosing all the contracts. DRC is a great example of that. So there needs to be more follow-up and on that transparency. But once you level the playing field, then you can really start to eliminate some of that exploitation. So I think we highlighted some of the ways, and you know, on that transparency front, you know, the gold trade data right now is 2 years old. If you're trying to get access to this, and so the sanctions bodies are just, you know, playing catch up with people, with these smugglers, very few of whom have been sanctioned. We need a much better system. The industry is developing this thing called the Gold Bar Integrity Initiative, which the U.S. government needs to work together on them. We should not be behind this curve. We should be working with industry to help lead these initiatives.
Thank you. And since you brought up the role of the UAE gold trade in Sudan, I just want to highlight that in 2022, over $30 billion in gold was smuggled from the African continent to the UAE. And this illicit trade has fueled conflicts in the DRC, South Sudan, and Sudan, where UAE-based companies have purchased gold from the RSF, as we mentioned, who is committing genocide. You know, you talked a little bit about how the U.S. can take more actions against UAE-based companies. Could you elaborate on how the U.S. should hold these companies accountable? And beyond in Sudan, where it's become very clear the role that the UAE is playing, what other concerns are associated with Emirati mining companies' involvement in the mining sector?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. Thank you for highlighting that and for your leadership on this issue. We really need a better system to independently monitor global gold trading centers, the UAE, Hong Kong, Switzerland, Brazil. There are certain choke points where illegal gold, whether it's from Venezuela, Sudan, with genocide happening, Congo, et cetera, are going, right? And so the Kimberley process for conflict diamonds actually provides a useful window into how to do this. So they have independent monitoring teams that can go and inspect and certify these global gold trading centers, especially these cash for gold markets. If you're trying to buy, if you're trying to sell gold in the UAE or some of these other places, including Hong Kong, you can just get cash for a slight discount and nobody's really following up. And so, you know, I think it would be a great opportunity for Secretary of State Marco Rubio to help lead this with industry, who actually put pressure on the UAE and other gold trading centers in 2020, and then basically those centers did almost nothing, and now that pressure has been backed off. So I think it's imperative on industry to hold these global gold trading centers feet to the fire, and also for banks to conduct enhanced due diligence. They have a key role to play. These centers need finance and banking systems, and so banks can play a key role in that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On Sunday, I just returned from a visit to the DRC. I went to the DRC, Rwanda, the Republic of the Congo, Burundi, and Uganda. I met with the president in the DRC, the president in the Republic of Congo, the president in Burundi, and the president in Rwanda. I left encouraged in some ways and discouraged in other ways, as you can imagine. I feel like that there is unbelievable potential in the area for peace and security, and for the killing and the bloodshed to stop. The resources there are just through the roof, tens of trillions of dollars in resources. You know, DRC could be one of the wealthiest countries on the entire planet. But I do believe that certain things have to happen, and I don't know exactly what the answer is to get there. I think that, you know, for this to exist, the Eastern DRC has to be an area where everyone has a vested interest in the safety and security and the ability for foreign companies to come in and invest in the area. And when I say everybody, I mean the DRC, I mean Burundi, I mean Uganda and Rwanda, everybody that's there. We all know right now that the Eastern DRC is a completely ungoverned area. It's like the wild, wild East, right? And I truly believe that there is no ability for the government in Kinshasa to actually control that area right now. They do not have the resources or the ability to really impact what's happening there. And they are actually becoming, in my mind, just another entity there that is trying to take advantage of the resources there and get what they can. And everyone's doing it. We know this, right? We know that the Uganda is bringing minerals in from there. Rwanda's doing it. Burundi's doing it. Everyone is doing it, and there's really nothing there to stop them. I think that the Congolese government has to do a couple of things. One, they have to address a domestic issue, right? There are a large number of people in the Congolese that are not Congolese citizens, that are not treated as Congolese citizens, including most of the members of M23, so on and so forth. Now, M23 is a rebel group, and we know that there's an influence there, and there's a component of the Rwandan Defense Forces, the Rwandan military. But honestly, M23, with or without Rwanda right now, is pretty much uncontested in the area. They're just doing anything they want right now, and the Congolese military is not even fighting back right now. As a matter of fact, they're just running away ahead of the, M23, or in some cases, they're laying down their weapons and they're joining M23, right? So I think that the Congolese government's in a bad position here, but I do believe, it's been a long-standing issue, is my understanding, that there are certain people in the Eastern DRC that are unrecognized as Congolese citizens, and that maybe in part because this used to be Rwanda before the lines were redrawn many years ago, and and that used to be part of Rwanda. But I would submit to you that there's a large part of Uganda that also used to be Rwanda as well. And after it's been redrawn, now it's Uganda. Those people were immediately assimilated and treated as Ugandan citizens, but that has not happened in the DRC. And I think that's part of the problem. I think that this domestic issue has to be addressed, that everyone in the region, everyone in the country has to be treated as a Congolese citizen with all the rights and privileges of such. I think that this is a difficult thing to do, but I think at some point the armed resistance of M23 are not going to just put down their weapons and walk away. I think that they are an armed resistance. There has to be an effort somehow to incorporate them into the Congolese military and make them feel like Congolese citizens that are protecting their country, not what's going on right now. I think that that's one of the problems. I think the other problem is that they have the domestic problem, or they have the international problem, obviously, which mainly focuses right now with around the relationship with Rwanda. And I think that there has to be an ability for Rwanda and the president. I talked to Kagame, I talked to Tshisekedi, I talked to both of them, and I think that one of the biggest problems right now is personally they can't get along. And I think that at some point people have to put their personal differences aside. This has to be a region that's beneficial for everybody, that everybody sees profit, and everybody has a reason for that to be an area of stability, right? And I think that, I don't know the answer to this for sure, but the neighboring countries have to benefit from the minerals that are in the Eastern DRC as well, whether that's they have some refining capability and the minerals are mined there and refined elsewhere, or there's a refining capability in the DRC, refining capability in Rwanda. Everybody has an ability to make some money from what's going on there. Then I think everyone will have an interest in making sure that this is a safe and secure area. They're going to need foreign investment to come in. They're going to need other countries' businesses to want to come and operate there. Right now that can't happen because there's not the required level of safety and security, and there's not the lack of corruption. It doesn't, there's going to be a certain level of corruption everywhere you go. But, when I was there, I was shocked at the level of corruption there. I talked to a Swiss company this morning, and they told me that their company was worth something like $18 billion, and they got a tax bill last year for their company for $80 billion, which is ridiculous, right? And so they protested it, and they got it reduced to $1 billion, which is still hundreds of times more than the profits that they make in the year. So they're being taxed at an unreasonable rate. Bribes, obviously, are a big deal. The Chinese can afford to pay the bribes, or they're willing to pay the bribes, and we as the United States are not. Many countries are not willing to do that, so they end up being able to compete without competition. There's a biased justice system as well. You can never be assured that if you go there and you get into some kind of legal disagreement, that it's going to be a fair judgment, and they're going to rule in your favor if you're in the right. There's manipulated exchange rates. There's unreasonable fines. There's evidence everywhere that members of the government and their family are getting filthy rich from what's going on there, while the population there is starving and living in a horrible environment. I think that we have to come up with a way to fix this. I think that until that happens, a lot of this other stuff is not going to matter. I don't know the answer to this, but I would like to get your opinion, each of you. Do you think that in the current situation that we're in, and obviously there's other issues too, I just want to mention too, just for the record, but there are some, it's not all financial. Now I think a large part of it's being driven by the financial benefit from the minerals there, but I do think that there are other issues at hand too. I do think that Rwanda has a legitimate concern regarding FDLR and the terrorist threat on their border as well. They have a tourism industry that they have to protect that's up in the northwestern part of their country that's really right on the border with population centers there. If mortars and rockets start landing there, there's no more tourism there. I saw, maps, and this because you're from there, from the area. You've been there, some of you, and it's the city of Goma it's on the border, and it's one continuous city that goes into DRC, and there's no differentiation. So there has to be some level of security in that regard as well. So we need to figure out how we get these governments together, and we come up with a reasonable way that everyone can profit financially from partnerships there, so that they all want to see a level of safety and security there, and that everyone feels secure, because everyone is fighting some type of rebel group as well, whether it's ADF and the Islamic group that's up, that Uganda's engaged with, or whether it's FDLR fighting to overcome M23 fighting to overcome FDLR, so on and so forth. But my question is, do you guys, one at a time, I'd like you to answer me, do you think that the current existing government in the DRC has the ability to do what I'm describing? Mr. Nguramo, you want to start?
Thank you, sir.
And if not, what do you think the answer is in brief terms?
First of all, thank you so much for your attention to this ongoing crisis in the Congo and the region. And I appreciate very much to bring the attention about this crisis been going for quite decades right now. And I feel very fortunate, particularly in the United States, but all this time I'm always thinking about my fellow citizens, particularly in Goma. Here's the thing. When I look at this problem, I think to find a solution is possible. And let me use a story. When I was at West Point, 10 years ago, I was actually running a cadet, and I hope they're listening to me. We went along very well, very, very well. Actually, we're actually good friends. So in other words, peace is possible in that region. I just hope that the leaders, particularly the DRC, they understand that it's possible. And I really agree with everything you just raised here, sir. There's a lot of problems on the DRC side, but at the same time, the DRC side as well has to understand the problems of the Rwandan concerns, which is true, absolutely true. If you look at the UN reports that have been coming out in the past 4 years, with absolute evidences, there were collaboration between the senior authority officers with the FDLR. I'm not making that up. It's right in the UN report. Why did the DRC government tolerate that? Now you see the consequences. On the other hand, about, for example, the resources along those lines, I think there is a lot of existing mechanisms, economic, political. We just need to enforce them so that they can bring regional stability, for example, which I think is quite frankly one of the best things ever if the regional country actually focus on it with the Addis Ababa Agreement. And keep in mind that the Addis Ababa Agreement came right after the M23 again. Simply what's or the regional country, and particularly the DRC government, had to focus on implementing those policy recommendations that were in that agreement, including fighting the corruptions, implementing good governance, and the security sector reform. But what we've seen over the past, let's say, 10 years, I think, since the Addis Ababa Agreement was signed, really we saw little progress. Now, people can argue, the President Felix Tshisekedi has arrived, has not had much time, But come on, 7 years I think is enough to show what to do or the limits of what they can do. But I like to think that, particularly, so come back to your question, I like to be optimistic, but I'm not seeing any positive sign from the Kinshasa, particularly to try to address some of the root causes of how this conflict has come so bad to the point of, bringing the region again back to the mess we saw back in the 90s. And particularly because, and again, I point out the UN reports, which are very, very, actually, I always like it when all sides contest the report. It means it's credible, it's correct, because there's no pointing on one side, for example, when the government collapse, if anybody was reading quite carefully, objectively what's happening behind the scene, it was predictable. It was really predictable. For many reasons. I know there was no military strategy. It was just some kind of maybe a looting system from the DRC elites in Kinshasa, instead of trying to do what is correct. But anyway, sir, I'm optimistic. I'm very optimistic. I hope that President Kagame, Tshisekedi, all the efforts. I saw the meeting in the Doha, I think. I hope they're ready somewhere. But most importantly, I would like to really emphasize on Washington, sir. Washington, most of these guys are looking at the Washington leadership. They're looking up to Washington, particularly the Trump administration, what they're going to do. We have the G20 summit coming up in November. I really hope the Trump administration will be engaged. I think it will not look good for all the leaders in the world to be in Johannesburg or Cape Town with a mess just in the backyard. So we still have some time, I think, to do what we can and somehow bring to a successful conclusion along those lines. But thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your engagement on this issue. I see you've really been boots on the ground there. I have conducted due diligence in DRC for about 4 years, and up until now, I still have not been able to approve some of the traders and investors that wanted to go there. They're mad at me, but I'm doing my job. And so I think that goes to answer your first question about the ability. Christ said, "You judge a tree by its fruits." And the past 7 years, the fruits, have not been tasteful. So what I would say is as far as the answer to that ability, I think the president himself, President Tshisekedi, is juggling with that question. I think he's come to terms that he hasn't had the ability, and he's talked about a government reshuffling. If there's a government reshuffling that shows a drastic change in difference, perhaps that would embolden my answer to say yes. Give him another chance to show their ability, and then apart from that, I would say where the U.S. can play a role in helping with the ability. One thing the U.S. really does well is business, and when I mean even business between states. And the U.S. could help broker this business deal between all the parties. Me being in the industry space, I'm seeing this trend that I'm briefing Treasury on it every once in a while. Central banks are getting involved all over Africa. You're starting to see central bank gold purchasing programs happening. So now, in Tanzania, their central bank is purchasing gold. Ghana, their central bank is purchasing gold. And it's very interesting because central banks have sovereign immunity. So in a way, we can't sanction a central bank. So you have to be very careful with these programs that they're not masking bad behavior. But if they get involved in the market, it has a huge consolidating impact. So, if the DRC central bank became a gold purchaser, a local gold purchaser, and the other, they have central the CEEC. It's a community of East Africa of Central African states, which includes Rwanda, Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, and Congo Brazzaville, and Central African Republic. So they already have a framework to collaborate economically. So if the U.S. could be helpful in getting those interests aligned, it could have an impact on the ground. And I just want to make one important point. There's a huge difference between the government that you deal with and the people on the ground. The people are, in Congo, there's so many tribes. We're used to, intermarriage. Even my wife, she's from another tribe. I come from the Congo tribe. She's from, and so it's the people. What you're seeing happening among the corrupt elites sometimes is not a reflection of the people. So I think peace is available.
That's part of the problem.
Exactly.
People see this too. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for traveling to the region, Dr. Jackson. I viewed your trip from afar and really salute you for heading out there during this very challenging time. I liked your phrase, the wild, wild east. I think we need to use that more. First of all, I would say to your question, the any solution needs to start with the fact that the DRC is the DRC. There's talk of, annexing parts of it and so forth. The DRC is a sovereign country and needs to remain as such. Having said that, I think there absolutely is the possibility of a symbiotic relationship between the DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and other countries. We've outlined that in several papers that we wrote during the last M23 crisis. And I think that started to be followed for some time. And then people were tempted by illicit exploitation and smuggling and criminal activity on all sides, really. You highlighted that the DRC military units have aided and abetted a terrorist group, the FDLR, and that continues. So any relationship that can be symbiotic has to be based on transparency and accountability. Those who have been aiding and abetting the M23, those who have been aiding and abetting the FDLR, they need to be held accountable. They're looking to the United States. Are they going to do that or not? The European Union has actually taken some advanced action compared to what we have done. But the Trump administration did, sanction some Rwandan officials in M23, which was very good. It was a useful start. There needs to be a much better system for tracing and auditing the gold and the other critical minerals that are in the East, so that it's much more transparent, so that there can be processing facilities on the Congolese side and processing facilities on the Rwandan side, and everyone's very clear in a multi-stakeholder framework where there's real, as Thierry said, you can't just trust people to say, oh yeah, sure, it's conflict-free. Well, guess what? It's not. So we need to have real monitoring teams out there. And the ICGLR, I think, is a good mechanism to try to do that, but we need more support to that system such that it can be, actually workable. I think that the last point I would say is that, we need more democratic governance in the DRC, and it's not really democratic at the moment, and that really needs to be reformed and amended and shifted. Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Justin, for the question. I'm probably not the most qualified to speak about this conflict in DRC. I think my colleagues who been in the area and live there, I think, are better place to. But I think speaking from my understanding of some of the drivers of the conflict, I think there are two processes that have happened at the regional level. One, the process that, the Luanda process led by the Angolan president. They tried to, bring the two, DRC and Rwanda, to the table, as well as the Nairobi, process. And I think these two processes, in a way, should have at least, de-escalated the conflict. Unfortunately, I think, the government in Kinshasa is not buying into, the negotiation and demands. And currently, I think Angola is trying to bring them to the table. And one of the conditions now is the M23 is saying we also want to be on the negotiating table. So governments can negotiate, but the leaders of the group also want to be part of that negotiation, which I think is quite important. Of course, you cannot support, these groups to be part of, formal processes, but we have to accept that the situation has reached another level that it calls for, these measures that are not usually what one would want. So the DRC government should accept that at least we need to have, leaders of these groups to also come and understand what really their interests are. Then the other thing is around strengthening, the institutions, state institutions. Really, I think, DRC is a vast country; it's quite big, and and arguments that we have also heard that it's quite difficult to manage such a big country with enormous resources and so many people with interest. But I mean, the U.S. also, I think, can play a role through this critical mineral or security partnership deal, and come up with some sort of preconditions. Since DRC is already seeking to partner with the U.S., that can also be one of the preconditions to stabilize the region. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just close by saying I think there's incredible opportunity here. I think that the new administration, President Trump's administration, sees they want this the bloodshed and the violence in the eastern DRC to stop, but they also see the U.S. National security interest in the area, and that's DRC in particular, but all of the continent of Africa. And I think that if we can't get this fixed, if we can't develop this safety and security and the stability in the area, the people that win every time are the corrupt governments that are making money from it, and the Chinese who thrive in this type of environment, and on occasion the Russians. Thank you.
Mr. Olszewski.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Jacobs, and to all of our witnesses. I want to just say clearly we have an abundance of resources here, but also no shortage of concerns, and so worthy of our time and attention. So I thank you again for calling us together. I also just want to reinforce the point that Ranking Member Jacobs made earlier about if we're serious about exploitation, just making sure that we're taking the holistic view of things here. Certainly concerned about the impact of what the CCP is doing, but also thinking about those issues of transparency, economic opportunity that so many of you raised today. And so I want to just thank you for that. It's probably no surprise to members of this subcommittee that I'm especially appalled and interested in the stories of children who are victims of the sector that is fueled by violence, corruption, and cruelty. We know that there are as many as 40,000 child laborers in the cobalt mines now. Just this year, between January and February, more than 400 children in the eastern DRC were recruited by armed actors, with some as young as 14, being as young as 14 years old. We know that these children earn as little as $2 a day and face deadly landslides, hazardous conditions, and diseases, but continue to abandon school and work due to poverty and hunger. We know that, Mr. Dongala, I appreciated you mentioning the ways in which gold mining investments often reduce in less students in school. I appreciated also your comments about monitoring attendance levels in mining areas as we address these concerns. It's a real concern. The Human Capital Index for the DRC is at 0.37. That means that a Congolese child born today will achieve only about 37% of their full potential, compared to what would be if they had that full quality education, healthcare. It's one of the lowest scores in the world. Staggering 97% of 10-year-olds in the DRC cannot read and understand a simple text. And so in this committee and elsewhere, I will just continue to bang the drum about the importance of education among those other supports. Certainly, any successful strategy to address China's exploitation and support for Africa's use of its critical mineral sector must include these supports for families, children, and local communities. And so I will note in 2019, there were a number of large companies that do benefit from this cobalt mining, such as BMW and Samsung, that launched the Cobalt for Development program with the stated goal of supporting safer and more ethical practices. These initiatives included better access for education for Congolese children, which can help provide opportunity and reduce the prevalence of child labor in mines. I guess my question then, for Mr. Dongala and Mr. Obert, just in the interest of time, can you talk a little bit more about what initiatives have been most effective in supporting educational outcomes and providing those alternative options for income for child miners across Africa? And then if you could answer the question, especially in the context of without the presence of USAID and the ways in which those programs have been just gutted in recent months, so that we can scale the programs that can work to counter CCP dominance in the region and ensuring those critical extractions support local communities rather than exploiting them.
Thank you, Congressman. It's very refreshing to see someone so engaged on, it's a business question, but it's also a community question. From the private sector side, some of the initiatives that we've done, usually there has to be when a mining company or a processing plant is established either in Zambia, DRC, Ghana, I think in Cote d'Ivoire, they all have this same framework where the village leader, there needs to be an agreement with the village. And this agreement has most of the families that are impacted by the education, their children not going to school, are gonna be signatories to this agreement. The village that signs off on this community agreement for mining should have provisions on education. Say, hey, are your children still attending school? How many children do you have? Lean on that community agreement that the mining company has, and all the big companies have them, from Barrick down to the smallest, even the Chinese when they have to get some sort of community agreement where they're mining. It's just that community agreement is just, some random document that everyone kind of makes up, and it doesn't have real teeth. But if you start to require that agreement, monitors education. Hey, are your children, that we as a community sign off that we are committing our children to staying in school in the midst of these mining operations? Something that at least gets their attention on the issue, and then from there, I think initiatives can build on. That's what we've been doing, and I hope others can do more.
Right. So I think for me, better access to education is one of the most effective ways to, reduce child labor and exploitation in the mining sector, and particularly in the DRC, where we have this staggering statistics of, children as young as, 10 and 14 not being able to read and write. And child labor, I think, in the mining sector is often driven by poverty and lack of economic opportunities, and even, social protection systems. And when families cannot afford school fees, ultimately children are forced to, contribute to the household income by working in these dangerous, mining conditions. And what I think in terms of what those mechanisms, in terms of providing access to education could do, you talked about the Cohort for Development, which is quite a noble initiative that is focused on improving access to education and supporting safer mining practices, particularly for artisanal cobalt communities. But beyond, I think there are other initiatives that we have seen in DRC. I think in 2019, the government also introduced a nationwide free education policy. While this is quite an interesting program and increased school enrollment rates and challenges around, overcrowding in classrooms and teacher shortages, I think more needs to be done. You may also be aware of the World Bank Education Program, which has supported several education opportunities in DRC, including funding for school construction, teacher training, and curriculum development. But of course, these are not the only ones. UNICEF and even the International Labour Organizations have come up with some of, important mechanisms to support children to access education in the DRC. But one last one, I think the US could also contribute, is around conditional cash transfer programs that provide financial incentives to families for keeping their children in school. And this has been really successful in countries like Ghana, where this has actually been implemented. And I think it's something that can also be borrowed for the DRC context. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Radwigan?
Talofa. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you all for being here today as we examine the impact of how China's involvement in mining in Africa is. And being from the Pacific Islands, I care deeply about what's going on. So I'd appreciate the perspective of each of you. What way can we make existing legislation or regulations like the Frank Dodd Section 1502 account for community buy-in to the certification process, or encourage Africa moral sovereignty over the certification? Mr. Lezhnev?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. Very, very good one. When this legislation was originally drafted, and I happened to be around at that time as well, there were provisions that were added onto it, or that were part of it, that were there to support certification and support for artisanal mining communities in the DRC and in the region. And then when that piece of legislation, and I think in the House it was called the Conflict Minerals Trade Act, in the Senate it had another name, when it got folded into the wider Wall Street Reform Bill, some of those sections got stripped out, and there was money attached to those. I think it would be very helpful if Congress could allocate some support to the artisanal mining communities and for certification, because as we've seen, as you know, the other witnesses highlighted, the governments of the region are very corrupt, and they have corrupted some of these systems, and we need some better international independent monitoring and some support for alternative livelihoods, both to eliminate child labor as well as, you know, get some of these armed groups to make sure there's real, you know, inspections of these mines happening. And, you know, it's all there on paper, but, you know, is it going to be actually implemented? I sat on the governance board of an organization that's a U.S. government private initiative called the Public-Private Alliance for Responsible Minerals Trade, which is a great organization that supported efforts like that on the ground, but it's really been a drop in the bucket. So I would call on Congress to support those kind of initiatives more robustly, so that we can really begin to, you know, eliminate the smuggling and the illicit actors that have stepped into some of those voids.
Mr. Dongala?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I would say on the certification African moral sovereignty, my colleague Obert mentioned something about including village chiefs. You know, the role of the village chief in the Congo, and in many of the countries, is kind of a ceremonial role that is, and in DRC law it is recognized. There's a whole traditional court system that's recognized. Getting simply them to sign off on the community agreement is already required according to law, but if they can be involved in certifying, because now they're putting their moral obligation, their moral authority on the line. And usually in these communities, their moral authority is really all that they have. They kind of, sometimes they trade in that, which is very bad, but it's starting to have them sign off that, you know, this is not hurting your community is a step of accountability that could be taken.
Mr. Nguramo?
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you so much for your interest in this question. Let me just put things in perspective a little bit. When the Frank Act came out, I was still pretty much in high school in Goma, just to see how this has been going on, and maybe without a lot of progress on it. But here's the thing, I think my colleague have already mentioned a lot about this, and particularly Sasha and Dongala, who have been working on this for a long, long time, but I'll just insisted on making sure that we actually enforce our policy and the laws. I think it's really come back to that. If people don't see consequences of bad act or bad behavior, they can really change. So which come back to transparency, accountability. I like it as well to, you know, I think to relate to what Congressman just mentioned, education. Here's the thing, you know, most of these kids who work in these mines, I think they want just a good opportunity. They want to go to a library, they want to go to school, know how to read and write, and be able to access to, you know, information, make critical judgment of their own future. So we have to, you know, that's I really agree with the Congressman. We have to make a particular, we have to emphasize on education of communities. We have to build the grassroots, providing, first come back with stability of these areas, these communities, providing them the necessary needs like education, all kind of things, basic infrastructure so that these kids can have a better future.
Mr. Boer?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for this question. So for me, I think my colleagues have already mentioned some of the responses, but one of the critical things I think would be important is around supporting African governments in creating legal pathways for, you know, artisanal and small scales to operate under license and you know, even access to financial services. Currently, a lot of African countries criminalizes artisanal small scale mining, and we know a lot of the problems emanate from the fact that an unregulated sector, it's easy for it to be influenced. So I think, if the artisanal small-scale mining sector is operationalized, formalized, rather, and also supported in terms of access to finance for them to actually do the, due diligence or certification process, which is quite expensive for small-scale miners. I think that will, also, address some of the challenges around transparency and accountability. I think we need to ensure that companies are able to publicly or compelled to publicly disclose, their due diligence practices and processes, but even the names of their suppliers, to create more pressure on accountability. And lastly, while the DOT Act, I think, quite, a very important piece of legislation, I think the focus obviously has been on the three TGs. It could also be expanded to other, lithium, so that we are able to catch them all. So the limitation on the minerals, the three TGs, it needs to be expanded, the scope of the DOT Act. I think that would also assist in particularly looking at emerging mineral value chains like lithium, for instance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baird.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you witnesses for being here. We really appreciate you sharing your perspective about what's going on in Africa. But Mr. Nguramo, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, sir.
I want to congratulate you for graduating from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point.
Thank you.
But then I want to get into, in your testimony, you mentioned that the trade between Africa and China is estimated at about 282 billion or so, and it's growing at about 1.5% annually. And yes, almost all the investment in the mining and the infrastructure sectors, this is according to your testimony, without long-term benefits to the countries and the gross domestic products, or GDPs, of the populations there. So indeed, China routinely operates in the shadows of the governments that lack transparency. They care very little about accountability, transparency, human rights, and democracy. So I picked up that you wish to comment about the fact that political and social stability and prosperity in the DRC is essential to our national security. So in that vein, my background, I'm interested in agriculture. I'm taking a long time, but I'm finally getting down to my question. Okay, I'm interested in it.
Good, I'm sorry, yeah.
But increasingly, we receive reports that the local populations are very angry with the Chinese companies because of the environmental disasters that are directly linked to their negligent business practices. So do you believe that African governments are increasingly dissatisfied with Chinese companies operating in their countries? And have the environmental disasters caused by Chinese companies affected the agricultural sector across the continent?
Can you repeat the question, sir? I did not. Yeah.
I want to know if the Chinese practices and the destruction they've done to environmental issues in their country, has that been a factor across the whole continent?
Let me just mention a thing about the DRC because I've been tracking that closely, my home country. Definitely the CCP practices in the mining sector has been destructive to the local populations. There are some credible report by, for example, the Amnesty International, which has shown that, the lack of respect of environments, the lack of providing, let's say, adequate protective equipment to particularly young children who work in these mines have come to create some significant health problems to the children, including destruction of the environment. And it's translating into social conflict. As we can see, for example, in Ituri, I think it's one of the, case study we can look at. Now, how that I think will translate to maybe some kind of dissatisfaction of the population across the country, across the continent, I think is remain to be seen. But we can say that there's definitely some trends, and I think part of the reason why we are seeing all this conflict going around, particularly in the DRC and the Sudan.
Yes.
May I add, Congressman?
You bet.
On the agricultural connection to, we were doing some investigations in Ghana, and there's a whole new term they call galamsey, which is this, wildcat kind of mining of gold, and they pollute waterways all over the area. And the thing is that a lot of the conflicts in Africa is between the cattle herders and the farmland owners, and for the longest time, the farmland owners have been complaining about the cattle herders who come on their land and it causes, tribal conflict. But now they're complaining about the illegal miners, and this is in China. So it's actually becoming a farming issue as far as the pollution. And a second point on that is that it's not a one-off issue, but we've seen it probably in 3 or 4 different countries. Chinese firms are going into conservation areas, which they're supposed to be protected, but it gives them also the anonymity, and because no one is there, they can do it kind of without anyone looking. And so these conservation areas, which are like, usually, you're allowed to farm around conservation areas. So a lot of farmers, and these are smallholder farmers, they have a couple of acres, they use it for subsistence farming, feeding their families. They are the first ones to witness and also to feel the impact of illegal mining, sponsored by the Chinese. So I just wanted to put that on the record too.
I really appreciate that comment, because when you think about agriculture, and Africa has a lot of fertile land that could be used for agricultural production, but when you contaminate that soil, you're going to contaminate the food. And so, excellent point. Any of the other two have any comments in that regard?
That's a great question, Congressman. The prices of some of these minerals are skyrocketing. We all know gold hit $3,000 an ounce for the first time a couple days ago. And what does that do on the ground in countries like this? It just, is a flurry of activity. And when there's no rule of law, it's the wild, wild east, as Mr. Jackson said. So, I think the key is really the governance and the rule of law and reducing this corruption and kleptocracy. I've been to many mining communities in Congo where the alternative livelihood is farming, but nobody wants to do it because everyone can make a quick buck. And there's so many exploitative actors, from armed groups to corrupt officials, who are just going after these mines. So you need a much better framework. As Mr. Bore said, I fully support the formalization of the artisanal mining sector. Give them property rights, give them legal areas to work, and then the same thing for the farms. Make sure that is formalized and that there's not bribes being paid everywhere. Back earlier to Ms. Radewagen's question, we need some support for those alternative livelihoods, and that's really in the farming communities. So if we can help reduce the corruption and support the formalization, then I think that can go a long way to establishing better governance in this sector.
Mr. Boer, you have any comments?
Yes, Congressman. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think, Chinese mining operations on the continent have had a significant negative impact on agriculture, particularly through displacement, environmental degradation, water pollution, soil contamination. I think there's ample evidence of communities that have been relocated that rely on subsistence farming, but also even some of them that have been relocated large-scale farming. I'll give an example of a project that is owned by Cobalt, Jiang Cobalt, in Nguramo, the eastern part of the capital city of Zimbabwe, where big commercial farmers were relocated just to pave way for lithium mining. And of course, the communities also are complaining around the conflict on water resources for mining because of the intensive amount of water required to process lithium, and also for farming. So already, I think we are seeing the connection and the linkages between how mining by these Chinese companies, through illegal practices or irresponsible practices, are fueling even food insecurity. I can also give another example of a BYD-supported project where I think about 30 community households were relocated from their, village, and they were moved to a peri-urban area, and they were given just around 400, I think 450 square meters of land, and these communities used to live on agriculture. So I think there's broad evidence to show that agriculture is being impacted. It also, there are cases also from Sierra Leone where mining by Shandong has also, affected agricultural production. So food security, you talk of, subsistence living, even livestock. As an organization, as Zella, I think my colleague also mentioned about, moving into protected areas where Chinese companies are also now starting to explore mining, particularly in national parks. You might have, read in the news where we, filed an application, essentially an interdict before the court in Harare to, challenge the Minister of Mines who had granted a special grant. A special grant is essentially a special mining list, which allowed this, Chinese company to mine coal in Hwange, which is the biggest national park in the country. So we are seeing that, companies are also starting to, move away from where, naturally people live to go into protected areas where there is, less population. But of course, it's also impacting tourism, which also brings another dimension in how, mining in these areas is affecting, conservation efforts. Thank you.
Thank all of you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Let me, did you have one quick question? Because I have a series of questions. Oh, okay, thank you. Let me ask a few questions. I'll put them all out, and then whichever ones you would like to answer, please do. Building on Mr. Baird's comment about the local population's anger based on environmental degradation, how do you rate the environmental record of PRC mining companies in Africa compared to that of U.S. and Western companies? Have African governments sought to hold Chinese companies responsible financially or criminally for environmental damage that their business practices have created? We know for a fact that in China itself, not only do they not follow ILO standards on labor rights, they have egregious problems in China itself with environmental degradation. Why wouldn't they just then export that to their operations in another continent, which is, of course, Africa? And then what evidence, if there is any, do you see linking PRC mining activities to the funding of armed groups or militias in specific African conflict areas? Thierry, if you could speak to, based on what you've seen, the Chinese barter system that circumvents the US dollar system in Africa, can you expound upon that? Also in Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Zimbabwe, central banks have launched their own gold purchasing programs, which can often mask illicit behavior because they benefit from sovereign immunity. What measures should regulators and sanction enforcers take to ensure that our sanctions and other sanctions, like by the EU, remain effective? Let me also ask, if I could, what are the major goals and changes under the recently negotiated DRC, PRC, Psychomines infrastructure for mining rights agreement? What has the DRC government done with the reported $7 billion it received from this agreement? And to what extent have corruption and diversion of resources characterized this deal since it was signed? And where would you place the responsibility? Let me also thank you again, Sasha, for the recommendation for the illicit gold task force. I'm wondering if you're getting any traction. We'll raise it, obviously, with Secretary of Treasury and as well as State. I think it's an excellent idea. You might want to speak a little further on that. Then finally, I've introduced legislation, HR 2310, the Cobalt Supply Chain Act, just introduced it, and at its core is Section 4, a rebuttable presumption that covered goods and goods that are made wholly or in part with forced labor or child labor cannot come here, although if the company can prove it, that it's free of that taint in their supply chain, then it would be allowed to come in. I've patterned that after legislation I worked on along with other members of Congress There were 4 of us who did it on the Uyghur Forced Labor Act. And the rebuttal presumption is I think a novel way of saying, okay, you can export your goods, but they better be free of child labor and they better be free of forced labor of adults. There's also an enforcement strategy, Section 5, and then also a Section 6 that says clearly that no federal procurement of vehicles, federal vehicles can occur if, again, there's child labor or forced labor of adults coming out of Xinjiang, especially because we know that's where the cobalt is being processed. So your thoughts on that legislation? Because I think, platitudes are great. Again, I mentioned before about the zero tolerance initiative done by the human rights folks in DR Congo. Welcome it, but if you don't get enforcement, and I've done oversight hearings on the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, and while it's not perfect, because we had a de minimis provision in there, anything that's $800 or less is not subject to inspection, and it has been exploited with impunity, and we're looking to rectify that. So we're learning from our mistakes with that legislation, but hopefully this will be, a clarion call that we really don't want these kids being exploited anymore. When you look at how sick they get, many of them die. And then the fact that so much of this, as you all have testified, fuels M23 and so many other groups that are killing, maiming, and raping in Africa. We need zero tolerancy that has an enforcement capability. So if you want to speak to any of those issues that I've raised, deeply appreciate it.
I'll start with the one that was directed to me, and then we can sort of maybe divide them up. Regarding the gold task force, there's illicit gold coming out of the DRC, out of Venezuela, out of Central African Republic, out of Sudan, and yet, and like I said earlier, China is buying it up, hand over fist, and potentially going to establish a new currency which threatens our own. So we need to take bolder action to address this, and the U.S. government, I think, is well primed to be in a good position on that. I think a couple things that would be important for this task force. First of all, set up a interagency coordination body such that we can coordinate with industry, especially through FinCEN, to talk to banks more, to have a banking roundtable, et cetera, and then investigate and sanction the whole networks. We did a whole 6-month study on sanctions, and they're most effective when they really go after the networks. It's not just a one-off initiative. You start out with the smuggler himself, but he runs a series of shell companies. Then there's a refiner, then there are officials that work with them. Once you go after that and involve multilateral sanctions, European Union, even the UN if possible, that can have a very important impact. And then the private sector needs to play a really important role, in coordinating here. So, banks need to enhance their due diligence on monitoring of gold suppliers, and the industry also should coordinate this new gold bar integrity initiative with governments, so that there can be some cross sharing of information. I really think that having a central task force in the U.S. government that can address these various aspects could be very important. I'll over to you guys for those.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will go ahead and answer the Chinese barter system. What's interesting, so there were a lot of deals that we saw, like you can see with the Kabila deal for infrastructure for minerals, where they got copper and they were supposed to do minerals. When the government when the government of Tshisekedi came into office and they audited that deal, it was a barter deal. Okay, we'll build your infrastructure, you give us the copper. But there were no enforcements, no accountability measures. And what happens is they can mine unaccountably, and the government of DRC can do whatever with the infrastructure funds that were supposed to be put at disposal and work. So this barter system happens through either state-to-state deals, banks, local banks that are being established in the region are facilitating a lot of non-dollar transactions, which evades the U.S. dollar system and sanctions Then, since we're on the topic of sanctions, how can we ensure that sanctions remain effective? I think it goes along with his with Sasha's recommendation of an illicit gold task force. I would add the OFAC licenses, which is already existing process. What that will do is it will gather data that can be actionable, live data. Because what's happening is, to apply for a license for OFAC, they would have to regularly share data of their gold trading activity. And this data will inform the OFAC, the illicit gold trade task force, of trends. And that's right now, the enforcers of sanctions are flying blind, really. They're trying to keep up with what everyone's doing, who the trader's doing, what's the new refinery, what's the new name, and all that. But I think that'll be helpful with making sure that sanctions. I think this is a breath of fresh air. What I'll do from my side, from the industry side, I'll encourage, I think we need to educate industry participants to know that it's not like a new regulation, something that they're not already doing, but what it is getting more details. And I would actually recommend for Section 6, if we could include weapons, procurement weapons. Now, you might have, that might be a whole lot of, a whole nother storm, but if you want to make it effective, because the reason why cobalt and lithium and all that is available is not only just commercial technology, but also weapons technology. So if you could include in Section 6 of HR 2310 weapons, I think that will be, a headliner also.
First of all, thank you, Chairman Smith. I really agree with the panel, Sasha and Thierry. I'll just maybe add, I think one thing in terms of like ranking. I like to think that Western companies are way better in many ways because, of course, it's not perfect, but at least we tend to care about issues like human rights, human dignity, fighting corruptions. It's not always easy, but at least we try, Yeah, and I like to think that Western companies see some kind of collaboration from these African countries, particularly the Congo, so they can meet at least somewhere to have some kind of a compromise along those lines. I'll not name any companies, but I work with maybe 2 or 3 companies who they run into some serious problem in the DRC. Part of it was because, maybe the moral standard was a bit high. Anyway, commenting on the CCP, how it's fueling, conflicts groups, I'll refer to the recent UN reports, not actually the recent one, but most of them of the past 3 years, I think. If you go to the appendix and with really overwhelming evidences, I mentioned this company, Norinco, which has been supplying weapons, basically actually to all the sides. Here's the thing. I like to think that the CCP will at least try to put some kind of guardrails, mechanism to say, hey, where these weapons are going, and here's the thing. And especially because we're in a situation where the MONUSCO is getting out of the DRC, with serious concern of leaving a security vacuum behind. We know the FARDC is not yet there to assume this kind of responsibility. Secondly, the UN, I think if I remember well, I think 2667 resolutions removed the arms shipment embargo to the DRC. So all these can create a high risk of proliferation of weapons in the area. So China, I like to think, should really care about these issues and really try to make sure there's some traceability and make sure that it does not increase conflict and violence. Subcommittee, Thierry already mentioned that. I think it was a great initiative, but the implementation was just a disaster. Over the past maybe 15 years, I think, it's been along those lines. It's very hard to see how those kind of agreements benefit the average Congolese person. Unemployment remained high, and sadly as well, the Felix Tshisekedi came in, tried to do some money revision, but we heard some payment were made. I think credible report, the recent by the IGF, the Inspector General of Finance. But where the money went, it's hard really to trace it. And I like to think that it's probably one of the reasons why we are seeing this dissatisfaction or disconnection between the Felix government and its populations. Because people are hearing all these revenues, but they're hardly seeing them in their daily lives. And I fully support the Global Supply Chain Act, sir. I'll just insist on enforcing these laws. I know it's tough, hard, but I think that's really the heavy work we have to do. We have to deploy all the necessary resources possible, learn from past mistakes. You just mentioned, we have to learn from what did not go well, upgrade those kind of policy, and where there are shortcomings, how we can do better next time and moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll address the question on central banks and responsible gold standards. So I think broadly across the African continent, central banks implementing a variety of measures to promote responsible gold processing and curb illegal, mining activities. I could, cite examples of Ethiopia, where the National Bank of Ethiopia and even Zimbabwe, where the Fidelity gold printers, and even in Tanzania, have all been coming up with, incentives for ensuring that actors that are in the ASM, that is now small scale mining, become more responsible. Safety and health has been one of the key concerns. Then also illicit, trade. However, I think what hampers, these efforts by central banks to promote more responsible gold processing is a policy of what they call no questions asked policy. I think, countries like Zimbabwe have been implementing this, no questions asked policy. And essentially, because government has been trying to mobilize, more resources, they just say, bring your gold and we give you your money. We don't ask questions in terms of how was that gold mine, using what kind of infrastructure, any child labor or any other related, forced labor alone. So I think that is a policy that has also contributed to some of the problems we have in the gold processing, and also more promoting these responsible gold processing initiatives. Then coming to your question around, I think the gold, Supply Chain Act, the Cobalt Supply Chain Act. I think it's quite an important piece of legislation that I think if implemented could actually address some of the problems we are talking about. However, I think while it is important that it's this presumption of that cobalt that has been processed in PRC or refined in PRC is associated with forced labor. The cobalt supply chain is very intricate, and if the act can also maybe consider what are the potential for other other actors that are not necessarily PRC that might actually be also refining cobalt and it's ending up into the US market. I think restrictions and even the enforcers of this law need to also be, thinking creatively and innovatively around, because it's not all the cobalt that is being refined in PRC, even though, of course, the focus has been, China. Then I think the other thing is around national security strategy. Because China dominates, cobalt extraction and processing, it's important for ensuring that there's more coordinated approach at the U.S., Africa, a level. African governments, as I mentioned earlier on, are all looking for investments that are going to be value-adding products on the continent, and that is a big opportunity that U.S. can also actually tap into and set up those refining and processing facilities on the continent. It creates jobs. It also creates the investments more secure and even, government buy-in. So I think we need to think strategically and ensure that whatever that we are proposing is going to allow, lasting solutions and benefits for both Africa and the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kamlager-Dove.
Thank you. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for allowing me to participate. I am no longer on this committee and I miss it. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. And also want to just thank the committee for making an accommodation for us to have a witness virtually, because not all committees do that. And I appreciate the chair for holding this hearing to address human rights abuses in the DRC's mining sector perpetuated by Chinese companies, but also by broader issues of corruption, impunity, and lack of economic opportunity that U.S. assistance should address, and was grateful to hear some of the earlier discussions about financing. But the other reality is that right now Africa does not have a partner in the White House, just by the very nature of dismantling our global foreign aid architecture and pulling back on key areas of engagement, something that China and Russia are applauding. There has been a zero Africa policy coming from this administration, and a belittling and a marginalizing of the continent, not just with its challenges, but also with its opportunities, and the global relationship that the continent has, not just with us, but with our allies and also with our adversaries. We talk a lot about exploitation, but there will be far more exploitation happening without any aid, you know, because rapings and killings and exploitation happens when there is no food, when there is no medicine, when there is no hope. That is just real, regardless of what continent you are on. The Death Eaters at the State Department and USAID have disrupted life-saving aid to the world's worst humanitarian crisis in Sudan and the Congo by ripping up PEPFAR, by exacerbating famine and attacking the international institutions that support stability in the region. By doing all of these things, we have also yielded to China and Russia in this space. The chair is absolutely correct. Platitudes are great, but engagement is more meaningful. And you cannot have engagement when you are not present. You cannot have engagement when you are not offering support and assistance. And if you are going to be silent in that space, then that also means you are going to be unbothered by human rights abuses, by conflict, by malign foreign influences that are spreading across Africa. And we can dangle as many mineral deals in front of folks as we want. But if you don't think that Africa is worthy, if you pay limited, if any, attention to the continent, if you siphon away and stop resources going towards the continent, you are aiding and abetting what China is doing. And Mr. Nguramo, and I hope I said it correctly, apologies, oh great, said, you know, CCP should or could put up guardrails, but who's going to make them? Who is going to make them? And if we don't even care enough about Africa to stay involved, then what would be our benefit to making them? I mean, so it's just like we have to take the rose-colored glasses off and live in the real world. And here are my questions. Mr. Lezhnev, in order to address exploitation in Africa's mining sector and pave the way for U.S. investment, what levels of sustained engagement and foreign assistance would be required from the United States? And is our posture on the continent currently conducive to promoting that?
It was a great comment, and thank you for the good question. I think that as the administration considers where to refocus some of the aid that has been suspended, I would highlight a couple of areas. Number one is we really need to legalize the artisanal miners to help them legalize. These people are mining day to day, right? But they need a legal framework to operate. We had the same thing here in the United States in California. Right, the rush of 1849, and the reason that we didn't have conflict minerals in California is because we had rule of law, so people had property rights and legally enforceable contracts, etc. These are the things that are needed in the DRC and elsewhere on the continent, and there are things that we can do to support that, support the DRC mining ministry, and help hold those accountable who are completely breaking it. Number two is much better support to certification process, right? There is, Mr. Smith, you mentioned the central banks buying. Well, the DRC set up a gold buying program the last couple of years that originally had UAE investment, then the Emiratis pulled out because the UN group of experts found that there were lots of conflict minerals in this gold buying program. It wasn't the central bank, but it was a similar setup. And so for high risk there's central bank buying and then there's central bank buying. So for high-risk areas like the DRC, it really needs to have proper certification on the ground. The governments of the region have agreed on a certification process. I was actually involved in Bujumbura when they wrote this thing, and we and some other NGOs advised on it. It's very good on paper. It has all these checks and balances, et cetera, but it's not being implemented well. And so that's where the Public-Private Alliance on Responsible Minerals Trade, there needs to be more support to that. And those are the kinds of things that can counter illicit activity by China and others.
So then what about, and my last question, Mr. Chair, what about also brokering a sustainable ceasefire to the destabilizing fighting led by the Rwandan-backed M23? I mean, can you speak about that? And I think that we have been missing in action, leading Qatar to convene peace talks between Congo and Rwanda. So does that play a role? I think stabilization in the region is incredibly important. And are you maybe aware of any U.S. role in trying to preserve the fragile ceasefire, I guess, that was reached last week? Maybe on Signal. Did you get anything on Signal?
I think that the ceasefire was a nice piece of paper that was quickly followed by a Rwandan military advance to Kisangani, or towards Kisangani. And the reality is, unless Rwanda and the DRC actors who are aiding and abetting other armed groups like the FDLR, unless they're held accountable, then these pieces of paper will be completely meaningless. I think that the initial step of sanctioning a senior Rwandan government minister and some M23 officials and companies was helpful. The European Union followed by much stronger sanctions. These one-off initiatives are good, but they're not going to mean anything unless there's actually a sustained program to pay attention to that. And then once there's a level of seriousness to it, I mean, as somebody highlighted earlier, the DRC army is running away at present, then, you can see some progress. 10 years ago, there was progress, and the blueprint is there in front of us. There was an M23 conflict, and Rwanda withdrew once there was serious consequences. In particular, World Bank money was pulled out, and that had a major impact because that's direct budget support.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you for your interest, your dedication, and your sincerity in trying to find reconciliation and peace and prosperity to this region. To my esteemed colleague, Congresswoman Kamlager-Dove, thank you for your insight. The Trump administration has embarked on a campaign against USAID over the last 2 months, shuttering thousands of U.S.-funded assistance programs across the globe. At least one of those programs aimed at improving accountability in the DRC's mining sector. The project in partnership with Enterprise EGC and Responsible Mineral Initiatives, RMI, aimed to ensure that the production and export of cobalt and other strategic minerals in the DRC met standards of social and environmental responsibility and traceability, and to address some of the complex governance issues that contribute to the perception of DRC as a high-risk investment destination. This program has since been terminated. I'd like to first start off with Sasha, if you don't mind, and I thank each of you for your time and talent that have come before us today. Can you please explain how the extraction of critical minerals in the DRC fuels conflict?
Sure. Thank you for highlighting these important issues, Congressman Jackson. Yeah, I mean, it's very unfortunate that there are critical minerals in Eastern Congo. Tin, tantalum, and tungsten are the three that are, unfortunately continue to fuel some of the conflict. I will say, I've been working on the DRC for about 17 years now, and the situation for those particular minerals was much worse before, and you had basically a free-for-all at mines, and companies had no idea where they got their minerals. Now you have a auditing system that industry set up, thanks to Congress, to trace and audit these minerals, and almost 2/3 of them, 66% of the smelters, which are the key choke points in these supply chains, have now actually passed these independent audits. The issue is that there's some smugglers on the ground who take advantage of some of these loopholes and this traceability mechanism, which we talked about earlier, the ITSCI, which is pretty opaque, and why the electronics industry suspended them, have gotten around some of those systems. So there needs to be better enforcement of the certification mechanism and some of these transparency standards, so that there can be a much better symbiotic relationship between the DRC, the DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, etc., whereby there can be a peaceful trade, and there has been a peaceful trade for some time, but unfortunately, Rwanda and others, have stepped in to take advantage of some of that. But I do believe that can be restored, as long as there's real consequences for the illicit actors.
Thank you. As well, Mr. Thierry, as well, do you believe that the gutting of U.S. foreign assistance in the DRC creates a void for China to fill as it further pursues control of critical minerals?
I would say, based on my statement, I think the void is created by our absence. The sanctions system, I said, is pretty much all stick and no carrot. So I recommended that we have carrot sort of involvement with OFAC, the Treasury, OFAC licensing. But then what's happening right now with the assistance program, I would almost defer to Congress, because the spending authority is yours. Under law, there is a presence, but it's just that right now we're going through a situation where the U.S. government is deciding to review all of these spending decisions. So I think it's calling for the leadership of this committee on these decisions to guide the administration on how to make these most effective. So I think the leadership of Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Jacobs is probably warranted the most right now, to make sure that there isn't an absence or a void in the midst of these decisions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Thierry. Well, again, I thank each of you, and I would probably add to that, for the record, there's been a gutting of this department. When the employees have been removed, life will go on. There will be a continuous void, and to rebuild what they've taken out in the last 2 months could take us 5 or 10 years from trying to capture that intellectual talent and restaff these agencies. But then again, I'm honored to be here with my esteemed chairman, Mr. Smith, and again, thank you each for coming.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jackson. Anything you'd like to add before we close? Because your testimony has been outstanding, incisive, and give us a blueprint for action. Thank you. Mr. Boer? Thank you. Thank you, and the hearing is adjourned.